Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, a university nutrition professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in.
Market news from the food world.
Hey, everybody. Before we get started, just a quick update on the podcast itself. A lot of you realize that we have had a season 0 up through, it's actually episode 20, but they're very short episodes. The whole intent is to do the news segment of what was on Iron Radio, and as many of you have pointed out, it's really always been about nutrition for me. Obviously, the bodybuilding and a lot of exercise science is also a part of that news, but oftentimes it is nutrition because a lot of people in fitness are interested in it. It's hard to believe that it's been a month already as we get the technology in place. We still are moving toward iTunes, which was always our bread and butter when it came to the 12 years of Iron Radio. But I also appreciate the feedback that I've been getting from longtime listeners. It's really important. It's almost like, again, that pilot season. In fact, it's labeled pilot on our YouTube backup. By no means are we going to try to push YouTube. It's just a nice backup for people who want to use that if they want to listen through some living room device, something like that. And you're going to see that reflected there. The hits and the views are going to be very low because, frankly, I don't care. The videos are too time-consuming. If you do want to see videos there, we did a couple that weren't just audio, and those are the ones that have a specific image of some kind on the front and not just the nutrition radio icon, if you will, for nutritionradio.org. And the other consideration was time, of course. We wanted this to be sustainable from the time perspective. It does look like these short episodes that are about 10 minutes each, just like with podcasts I've done in the past, plus or minus a certain percentage, but about 10 minutes. That is, in fact, doable. It's something that I can do on Saturdays, do a little batch processing, if you will, and go through a lot of the same topics that we were going to do on a daily basis. In the future, this may become once a week, but I think because of time and schedules, if I do this just myself, you don't have to endure 60 minutes of essentially a lecture from an old professor. You just get a condensed 10-minute news bit for your commute to work or whatnot. And a lot of that started with I'll leave names out, but an occupational therapist who was a former student and longtime listener actually overheard my voice in the hospital recently. And he said, hey, how about, a 10-minute length? And that made a lot of sense to me because, of course, I can record for, 60 or 90 minutes on a Saturday and then chop up these episodes based on topic. So that's what we're going to do. And today, in fact, we're going to talk about one of those, which is food markets and even food science, probably expand it into food science. So here we go. There is a new article in the IFT magazine, the Institute of Food Technologists here. It's not the most recent one, but it's a very recent one. And it's about microbial loads in spices and powders, dried seasonings in this case. This is a little disturbing because I think a lot of people that are interested in nutrition and fitness, they lean pretty heavily on spices. And over time, maybe they learn that the dried stuff that you get real cheap is not quite as pungent or satisfying as fresh herbs and that kind of thing. But a lot of this stuff, of course, is used. So here's some stuff for you that you may or may not know about spices that you're using in your meals. And we'll even drift into ready-to-eat foods and ready-to-drink RTD products that a lot of us probably use. This is from Jane Caldwell, Ph.D., a contributing editor and food safety expert. Let's start with this. In the United States, the majority of spices are imported, since many grow in tropical and subtropical regions. A simplified definition, then, of spice that we're getting often from these places, according to the FDA, is any dried aromatic vegetable substance where significant function in food is the seasoning rather than the nutrition. And again, that's FDA 2017. As you might guess, spices, like other foods, are at risk of being contaminated. They're exposed to contaminants from the farm to the fork, if you will, through this big process. one of the things that's usually a worry when it comes to microbial contamination is the water activity, right? If there's more water around, that's where bacteria can grow. If there's less water around, there's a bit less of that. But this idea of contamination, it's not just salmonella, although that's a big one, or some of these bacteria. It's filth. Literally the term filth. I remember learning about this years ago when it came to tuna, and I'm like, a certain percentage of the product can actually be filth. And I was sort of aghast. So let me share some of this with you. It might also shock you. Filth adulterants such as live and dead insects and their parts, animal excrement, human and animal hair, feathers, stones, twigs, get this one, staples, wood slivers, plastic pieces, synthetic fibers, rubber bands. All of these things have been reported in spices. That's pretty scary. Obviously, they try to keep that to a minimum, but that's what filth is. We're going to focus mostly on microorganisms, right, bugs that can make you sick, and how those get into spices. If you think about some of the spices you might use, maybe you use curcumin. Maybe you just take that as a supplement pill. Or black pepper, right, which has functionality because of the pepperine in there as an absorption enhancer. And, of course, there's powdered garlic and other things. But we're focusing on things that are not meant just for that sort of bioactive or functional benefit, but for flavor, right, in foods. But I also want to just do a little side tangent here on ready-to-eat products. Ready-to-eat flavorings, products that have a matrix with flavorings in it. These flavorings, or spices, oftentimes they get introduced into these very complex, sometimes, matrices of food. And when there's enough water activity in there, the bugs can grow. One of the classic examples here, and this is not so much spice, but it's a first-hand observation that's happened twice in my family, is ready-to-drink protein drinks. Obviously, all that protein in there and a lot of fluid, water activity, if you will. That's prime place to grow these sorts of things. But I consumed one once. This is the Tetra Pak things that aren't refrigerated. And I'm not saying they're all unsafe, but in this case, I believe it was a research batch, and it might have been a little bit past its due date, so this is my fault. But I got quite sick. It was really quite scary. This happened to my wife with almond milk. Again, a Tetra Pak of unrefrigerated, because, of course, when you're not refrigerating things, they're in that danger zone of activity between 40 and 140 degrees, you'll often hear. So they're in that danger zone for bacterial growth. Anyway, so these things can happen. And in today's topic, of course, including in your spices. It says from 1973 to 2010, there were 14 illness outbreaks worldwide, specifically related to microbial contamination in spices. And the reference here is Van Doren et al., 2013. So again, thank you, Jane Caldwell, Dr. Caldwell, for digging all this stuff up. 70% of the illnesses were due to the consumption of these ready-to-eat foods prepared with spices that were applied after the final pathogen reduction step. So that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? You make sure the food is safe. You do whatever you have to do with irradiation or the different ways that they deal with this, reducing microbial activity. And then you add the spice, because here it says no pathogen reduction step had been applied to the spices themselves in 75% of the outbreaks. So adding them afterwards, probably not a great idea. The article goes on to say, to be in compliance with the FDA, salmonella is the primary target microorganism when it comes to public health significance in spices. And that's according to Laura Shumo, Executive Director of the American Spice Trade Association, the ASTA. So they're using salmonella as sort of a marker, get that number way, way down with these different methods like irradiation, steam, fumigation. Those are the main industry methods to try to get the microorganisms down. Now, one of the problems with some of these things, like the ones that involve heat, including steam, is the polyphenols in spices. Those are also have functional benefits, right, as we were talking about. They're highly volatile. They can be negatively affected. You can lose, color, flavor, or in our case, even some of the health benefits that you often hear about spices. There are some new things coming down the pike, new technologies that food scientists are using. One of the ones I find the most interesting, and we'll focus on today because there's too much here to do, is ultraviolet C. The ultraviolet C light-emitting diodes. I mean, there's cold plasma and ozone and other things that are going to be looked at here, evolving in the industry. But the UV light is something that's interesting to me because of the recent COVID outbreak and how they're trying to use UV light in some applications in that way. I definitely don't want to make this about COVID, but just as a side education bit, if you go to nationalacademies.org, a legitimate source for science information, they do talk about the claim that UV light destroys the novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19. That's true. It's been shown to quickly inactivate the novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2. It can be an effective disinfectant. It just needs to be correctly used to avoid damage to the skin and eyes. Why UVC? Well, there's different wavelengths, right, of UV light that comes from the sun and these different lamps, UVA, UVB, and UVC. UVC light is something that they're using here because these wavelengths have the most energy and they really disrupt and quickly destroy the genetic material inside viruses and other microbes, rendering them inactive. Okay, so this is one of the reasons that I thought this was probably one of the more interesting ones. The article goes on to point out that despite current use to decontaminate fruit juices, cheese, produce, tuna, and chicken, that ultraviolet LEDs are just now being investigated for powdered ingredients such as spices. And that's according to Nyhan, Nyhan, et al. 2021. And it has been shown to be effective. The problem is that sometimes powders will form little cavities and, it shifts around and not everything gets bathed in the UV light as much as it probably could. So that could be a problem that needs to be dealt with. There is mention here, though, that the organoleptic properties are not always evaluated in these studies where you get the microbial reductions. Organoleptic, right, just meaning pertaining to sense organs, taste, smell, that sort of thing, sensory things, which, of course, as we pointed out, is the kind of the main purpose for the spices. So anyway, just a little bit of information for you there. I won't get into cold plasma technology and some of the other things, but it is interesting that you have to be cautious when it comes to spices like anything else. The FDA is looking out for you in this regard, but it's something we all do, and awareness is a good idea. So that's going to be it for today. We'll see you next time.
The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.